Greetings, ladies and mentalgets, and welcome to this latest episode of Tales from Outer Space, where I take a space-related story from around the internet and read it out loud for your enjoyment. All the relevant links are down below. Please don't forget to do the usual YouTube gumph, because if you don't, the nanite swarms will steal your other sock. But more importantly, as always, I hope that you enjoy. I'd quickly like to thank the following Tier 5 patrons and channel members for supporting the channel: Datamagnet and Bob the Dragon. Thank you very much. Red Blood, written by Bigbluebuttonman. Ever since humanity had entered the fold of the Galactic Alliance, GA, in 3071 human years, tensions had unfolded. In the first talks that had taken place between the Federation and the representatives of the Galactic Council, GC, the human diplomats had always been accompanied by certain advisors, quiet and stoic, saying nothing most of the time. The talks were typical for interactions between the GC and prospective members, but these advisors, silent watchers, would always walk up and whisper something in the ears of the human diplomats that couldn't be heard or understood by the GC. When pressed by the Council, the diplomats replied, "Just keeping us up to date on our defensives and securities." Nonchalance on the matter only made interactions fuzzier. However, there was no outward aggression or other indication that humanity would be a problem. Human diplomats were just peculiar, so the GC let humanity in. Outside of the secrecy, the humans were perceived as an above-average species. Space travel was subpar, with faster-than-light FTL engines reaching half of the standard performance and a fourth of the top engines. Infrastructure was in the middle of the road. The technological level was above average for the species upon entering. Their mathematics had some catching up to do, too. Biology didn't seem to be on their side. They were fleshy, not hard-skinned, and not very nimble. They couldn't climb surfaces very quickly or climb very many of them. Strength was lacking. Mobility was lacking. Human immune systems were weak. Outside of these impressions, the rumor mills spun up about secretive aspects of the Federation. On the fringes, conspiracy theories and plans to attack the GA or subvert it abounded. These theories and other skepticisms merely continued the more the GA citizens got hints and whiffs at the Federation's system of governance. Compartmentalization, contingency plans, need-to-know basis. Federation diplomats continuously put on a smiling face every time their secrecy came into question. GA citizens could never tell if they were truly genuine, but most hoped for sincerity on the part of the diplomats, and granted the benefit of the doubt in the end. Overall, the alien species found little reason to be afraid of humans on the surface, other than their curiosities. Shortly following the membership status, about a month's time, the exchange of peoples began. Humans would visit the alien worlds, and aliens would visit the human worlds. Handshakes would be made where possible. Tourists would gaze upon cultural wonders. As the early interactions with humans continued, affairs did not go without incident. Accidents happened. Sometimes a human would cut themselves within the sight of others, usually while making food or while running around in a drunken stupor. Accounts circulated in the galactic press, and the rumor mill went to town. Old legends and myths were called up. Eventually, it was confirmed. Yes, they had red blood, crimson blood. No previous civilized species in the known galactic worlds had it. And those worlds that did were inhabited only by primitive species that hadn't yet reached the full range of sentience that the developed member states did. Their trait reserved for only the most ferocious of worlds. The GA had experience with red-blooded worlds, where the majority of these species bled red. Horror stories of explorers and even gaggles of armed mercenaries getting lost in these worlds and never coming back were common. The vicious sights and creatures of these worlds haunted the GA member constituents. Myth and legend abounded about why red-blooded species differed this way. If one wanted to sit around a campfire and scare friends, just tell a story or two about red-blooded monsters. While the civilization had not yet developed out of these worlds whose beings bled crimson, they were theorized. The hypotheticals were never pretty to GA constituents, especially so with the myth and legend to fuel the fear. A red-blooded developed society became the ultimate boogeyman to many of the GA worlds. Most species had a collective freakout, instantly connecting the secretive behavior of the diplomats to the blood, although they could not justify any connection beyond their own suspicions. Demands came to bar the humans from the Alliance, to cut off all trade relations, block space travel beyond a specified no-go zone, and leave them to skulk in their own little space room. In essence, the galactic equivalent of being grounded. Some species, however, proposed more extreme preventative measures. Interventionist proposals from these member states included total subjugation or mass deportation. Sterilization and mass killing were demanded by the harshest of individuals, largely the rantings of the rabid thinkers of influence. Get them while they're weaker. The GC insisted on reining in the behaviors of the increasingly rogue powers, seeking to contain the humans but avoid an unnecessary war. It did no good. By the time any real move was made to restore order and deliberate on official policy, ships were already entering into human space. The Galactic Council was convinced the humans would lose, too unwilling to plunge the GA into civil war and too prejudiced against humanity. They made no further actions to stop the rogues. Upon arrival of Yaris 6, a human colony world, the humans were initially confused until the ships spied upon the planet's metropolitan areas. Defenses fired back and were silenced in response. The ships landed, unloaded their troops, and massacred a population of tens of millions in a matter of weeks. Moments after the first shots had been fired, an emergency communication system, using the principles of quantum entanglement, immediately alerted all other human colonies and homeworlds. The network was little good for anything other than the galactic equivalent of Morse code, but sufficient for the task of instantly updating the whole of the Federation. And so, contingency plans were put into motion. The invading alien force started with 5 human colonies, striking Yaris 6 first, and attacking the rest in succession, with all human colonies alerted to the nature of the attack. Affairs ground to a halt on the subsequent targets. Once orbiting fleets blasted anti-space defenses into dirt, and ensuing ground troops found themselves bogged down, the invasion reduced to a snail's pace. Far more humans were armed than during the first colony massacre, making every square meter a battle, no matter the location. For every 5 humans killed, one of theirs went. But there were always more humans around the corner. Combat was slow, tedious, and brutal. Humans didn't fight fair. Guerrillas would sneak behind lines under the cover that they could and detonate themselves with explosives, or commit other butcheries on the enemy where possible. It was easy to do so after Yaris 6. Even though the task force had sought to destroy much of the industries in the orbital attack, the numbers of weapons, small, medium, and heavy, that the defenders still brought to bear was shocking and unprecedented compared to the expectations of the alien fleet with the first encounter in mind. It was taking months to clear any city. Space affairs were not quiet in the meantime. Occasionally a few ships would interject into the affair. Not large, but hard to hit, very nimble. They tended to poke holes in large battleships and attempt to discharge jet clearers into them, like a poisoned dart injecting its dose. The attacks were mostly failures. The ships were not well acquainted with the arsenal of the alien fleets and could only guess where to poke a hole to force the breaching forces. But one such attack eventually yielded success. Too preoccupied with the ground war to deal with the gnats, the fleet commanders didn't notice when one of these smaller ships disappeared, not with an explosion, but with a flash of FTL engines. A year into the invasion, the fleet's obligated to just bombard the remaining strongholds for a few months straight, even if it left survivors for later disposal, and move on to the next system on their checklist. When the fleets arrived at the dedicated homeworld systems, the war was over. Homeworlds were surrounded by gigantic swarms of ships and further aided by equally vast defensive installations. Superiority in arms was not enough to win the day. One hasty exchange of blows later, the alien fleets retreated, but not before losing most of their numbers. Upon returning, the rogue nations began preparing for the inevitable, scared witless by the last battle, building up the fleets they could with their existing industrial war capacity and preparing for an invasion. For years, it never came. There were reports of activity here and there, of ships quickly blipping in and out before disappearing back into the void. No doubt, the rogue nations figured that it was scouting activity, but could never ascertain what they really knew and how it would factor into the impending invasion. Finally, the hammer fell, and the human fleets pierced the territories of the rogue GA members with a blistering speed. Federation fleets were jumping between systems faster than any other GA fleet could, leaving battered systems behind. Any possible ground defense, space installations, or any other logistical military assets were hit with an extraordinary force the moment fleets entered the system. The most that would be reported of these encounters were of large fleets blipping in and swiftly unloading cargoes on priority targets where they're already picked out in advance. Every alien ship met a different fate. Sometimes swarms of small fighters ate away at the ship defenses, leaving it open to heavy artillery from the main fleet support ships. Sometimes breaching crews would do the dirty work, perfected from previous experience, even commandeering some ships and turning them against the enemy. Other times, straight ship-to-ship combat ensued, with battleships and battlecruisers exchanging blows directly. The rogue nations surrounded in short order, 2 months into the counter-invasion in 3075. Afterward, the Galactic Council asked the Federation for leniency to heal open wounds and mend broken relationships. Such sentiments were not genuine desires for clemency. They only wanted the closest thing to a status quo of 3070. The Federation ignored them. Most aliens on the occupied planets were killed within a span of 2 years, with only a very select few taken in for scientific analysis. With worlds swept of alien life, the humans plundered everything else of value from the worlds following the purge, whether the remnants of the entire civilization's history, culture, and technology, or planetary resources to feed the industrial bloodline of humanity. Responding to the horrified GC's babbling, one human diplomat gruffly replied, "Did you wail and scream this much when you left us all to die?" In the developing decades, the Alliance members, what was left of them, found themselves ruthlessly strong-armed. "You can't go there, you must pay this much money. We want 5 ships to be allowed to patrol these worlds." And many more demands aside. Every time, the Alliance acquiesced. What could they do when the massacre was the alternative? By 3200, the GA could hardly consider itself anything more than a vassal state. While their power was whittled away, they had decades of time to grieve their status of the fallen empire. Decades of time to lament the fate of the GC's subjugation. Decades of time to rage at the laws pushed on its constituents. Decades of time to reflect. If there was one benefit in the aftermath of the war, the scholars and intellectuals of the GA had plenty of opportunities to research why they lost. Investigative efforts were made easier by collaboration with human society that was both all too willing to brag about its history and all too eager to figure out what supposedly made their blood so vile as to justify the unprovoked invasion. Humanity spent every waking moment of its life embroiled in war with itself It was practically a pastime, a natural consequence of red blood. Why the fluid made species more volatile and brutal still wasn't quite understood by humanity or the subjugated territories, just that it did. Regular worlds in the alien territories were considered pastoral and tame by the standards of the humans' birth world, Earth. As much as humans found themselves bewildered at how any life in these worlds developed into civilizations, the other species were equally bewildered at them. Humans found such worlds, from their perspective, too conducive to genetic complacency. The GA found red-blooded worlds too chaotic and prone to harming genetic progress than helping. Regardless, the difference between the evolutionary paths was the difference between calm rivers and raging oceans. The GA species developed gracefully by comparison. Humanity developed as viciously as the world before them lived and breathed, in a constant state of perpetual war. First against nature, then with itself. War ebbed and flowed, but never stopped. Not until the discovery of a tangible evidence for the existence of alien life. Every facet of human experience could be traced back, in one way or another, to the drive to survive against the competition from other animals, the elements, or themselves. No other member of species of the GA endured this prior to membership. Consequently, in every way besides the technological disparity between GA and the Federation upon first contact, humanity was overwhelmingly better at war. The collective experience and almost ceaseless pool of knowledge around humanity's walls granted the Federation adaptability in war that no other species had, and tactfully and strategically using any means available. In the arc of development, human nations eventually always had plans on the standby. They needed to, just in case. Another result of constant war-making was the weaponization of an entire society, the ultimate manifestation of war. Every element of civilization dedicated to victory, any sacrifice allowed, all barriers removed. When death was the only alternative and the population was concerned, nothing was off the table. A situation repeated multiple times in human history, and not once in the GAs. The Federation at 3071 thus held expertise in immediately shifting its civilization assets to a war footing in a short time span, and in accordance with any battle plans on hand. Humans wrote the plans with any knowledge possible that indicated the potential attacks could likely occur and how they would unfold. If any specifics were difficult, they wrote up a set of hypotheticals and the signs to indicate which one was the most likely strategy employed by the potential invading enemy at the outbreak. When the first alien ships struck, one such plan was chosen, informing all colony worlds to follow the plan's outlines with haste. Logistical operations shifted in concert. The human predictions ranged from invading force going planet to planet, destroying the surfaces with impunity, to almost entirely engaging on the ground. The invader strategy was somewhere in the middle, an extension of GA forces' existing tactical doctrine. During the lifespan of the GA constituent species, space versions of naval warfare and island-hopping strategies and tactics developed. Bombard to soften hard targets, land troops to conquer the territory. A game that humanity had already played and perfected. GA worlds kept military and civilian affairs generally separate, in peacetime or not, along with militaries maintained at relatively small size proportional to the whole population. Once it was clear someone was going to lose, the other side surrendered and submitted to the terms and conditions. GA species were not unfamiliar with the concept of annihilating worlds. They had the means to create weapons to do so. They just didn't want to. They didn't wish to engage with even a remote possibility of mutually assured destruction. It was madness to them. Some weapons were perceived as too dangerous to be wielded by any species. Very few weapons of mass destruction left the drawing board. None deployed or even used. That and ruthlessly glassing worlds might forego other financially exploitative opportunities. Altogether, GA worlds engaged in little more than the human equivalent of skirmishes on a galactic scale. because they couldn't stomach doing anything else. They all implicitly agreed that they'd rather not flood their worlds with traumatized veterans, subject their own civilian populations to untold horrors as a matter of course, or endure the social consequences of fully militarizing society, let alone face existential risks. No member constituency cared about what other societies had to deal with, just what they would have to deal with, and all the board moves were made accordingly. Humanity could stomach far more sacrifices, especially when cornered. The GA lacked any extensive plans particular to human context by the time the invasion began. The rogues simply took their existing militaries and threw it at the humans in a paranoid, schizophrenic gut reaction, a strategy ripe for exploitation. Federation industry went into overtime producing weapons and chips to postpone the invaders, coupled with the appropriate tactics. In the long run, any attempt to appropriate technology was used, landing humanity on top-grade FTL engines during the war. And while the enemy was held at bay, humanity was producing a wall of steel across its worlds to consolidate itself at the front line, and eventually clog the invasion when it hit this wall and flush it out of humanity's system. The final defense force against the initial alien invasion was in fact crudely drawn up. Something revealed to the GA remains decades into the post-war years. With the pace of the invasion force, humanity couldn't make any ship or weapon more advanced than its enemy's weapons, but they could make far more of them. After all, the Federation merely needed to get the enemy off of their territory to allow itself breathing room and time to build the proper forces for a counter-invasion. With appropriated technology, humanity did. In less than a decade, the GA's rogue nations paid the price for their actions. Now, humanity owns the Milky Way. If the Galactic Alliance could, they would have fled to the Andromeda by now, maybe warn others of the threat. They cannot, however, for when they wake up from this dream of the galaxy without humans, their eyes open to meet an endless fleet of battle cruisers hovering above each and every one of their worlds. End of story. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you do, please consider supporting the author, even by popping over and leaving a thumbs up or a nice comment, just to show your appreciation for the story. However, if you wish to support this channel, there are links down below which will help immensely. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cheers.